Let me tell you of a secret that is old but well guarded, spoken of in hushed tones and only to the adepts who have earned the right to unlock its secrets. It is known by many names, but in this instance, we will refer to it by its exoteric name. It is called Alpha Draft. If you hunger, it will satisfy you. If you are unclean, it will cleanse you. If you need to go somewhere, it will transport you. If you seek answers, it will answer your questions. It is all things to all men. It is the universal panacea. Oh, fuck, wait, no, I'm thinking of the Philosopher's Stone. Actually, Alpha Draft is a fantasy esports service. So if you play like CSGO or League of Legends or Dota 2 or Smite, then they have tournaments on there where you get a set amount of salary and you pick the players out for the particular match or play day or tournament that you want to compete in. And some of them are free to enter if you're a little scrubber. If you've got a little bit more skill in the back pocket Rooney, then you can enter the small ones like $1, $5. If you're a baller, you can go all the way up to like $1,000. You can play against one person, just wreck that guy's dreams, leave him a broken mess, scrambling to get Skrill back himself. Or you could play smaller competitions, bigger competitions rather, that have like sometimes up to hundreds of people in them. Or medium ones, so like 50 or 30 people in. Some that just you win half the money. If you finish in the top half, you win twice as much money. Or some where you can triple up, or some where you can win significantly more than you entered on. There's all sorts of it. And if you want to play so, link in the description box below. Now, the concept of making your coach into your in-game leader, that is to say, having the designated person who stands behind you, who, if you have a coach, that's where your coach is going to be, and has a headset on, be actually fulfilling the role of the in-game leader, which up until previously was nearly always one of the 5 players in the game who comes up with the strategies outside of the game or improvises a strategy on the fly at the beginning of the round, calls the basic tactic, calls the mid-round strategies, adjusts the situations, and maybe even plays a large role in the picking and banning the maps. The concept of doing this is not a new concept. It's just that it's never fully been implemented until more recently. And even so, in terms of actually the number of teams that have used it, it's still extremely rare. But it's always talked about and it's always brought up as, you know, what if more teams did this? Is this the way a certain team should go, particularly if they have an in-game leader who's having difficulty fragging, or they have the option to upgrade to a better player in terms of overall fragger talent that's out there? Or people say, is this the future of the game? If the sport gets bigger, if there's more money, if there's more, is this a way to create like a new extra level of strategic depth to the game? So first and foremost, the point I want to make is that no, it's not a new concept. Like, first of all, this was actually suggested in Counter-Strike 1.6 days. So we're talking about like as much as 10 years ago. This is something I remember myself suggesting people think about in around like 2006 or so, because I remembered thinking back on some of the brilliant tacticians who had retired from play. So an obvious example would be Vestlin, someone who I did a Reflections with, I'll link that there, who was one of the greatest tactical minds of all time. But eventually his skills dropped off. He no longer wanted to play as a direct player itself, but he's someone who's always thinking about the game, who did coaching in other senses, and who, if you could have put him behind a team of players, particularly very skilled players, he could have made them fantastic. And especially in countries where they didn't necessarily have a brilliant tactical mind, a genius mastermind type player, even without playing, he would have been able to have an impact on these players. Likewise, it actually happened for a little while. In 1.6, Lurpis, the Finnish player, and now commentator / thinker about CSGO. In 1.6, he was a professional for a long time, and when he went over to Evil Geniuses, the North American team, they obviously could only use American players in their World Cyber Games lineups. So when they went to the World Cyber Games in 2009, 2010, 2 years he was there, he actually stood behind them as the in-game leader, because he was the in-game leader of the team normally, and basically led in this exact manner, calling from behind them tactics to try and allow them to have a chance to do well in WCG. And they had to use a stand-in terms of the players. And they never got super far in the tournament, but it had a reasonably decent effect. Definitely better than if they'd just been left to their own devices and had to just call without having him there, since he had pretty much shaped the philosophy and approach that their team took, and so he was the linchpin in that sense. And we've obviously had it in latter days of CSGO with the Kingwin team, because first of all they had Emilio, and then obviously that didn't go so well. And then we had Legija, or whatever you say his name as, the former mouse sports player, I think was fulfilling a similar role. Now, the basic concept behind this is that by removing the in-game leader being an actual player literally in the game, he's still going to be the leader of the game, but he's going to be just a leader behind. you, first and foremost, the best reason to do it is actually to allow you to have more fragging power. That's usually the angle most people come at it from, which is that now you can have another star aimer type player. Now, the reason why this is strange to me is I can understand that certain teams lack a bit of firepower. They don't want to replace another player who they think's good. But oftentimes, the people who are the in-game leaders aren't playing particularly high fragging roles anyway. So even if you added a bit more fragging from their role, or the positions that they play on the map, which tend to be the more supportive ones where you need to throw a flash off, a tiny bit of timing to back someone up or watch someone's back, I'm not sure that those particular roles would generate that much more impact on the actual rounds in terms of pure fragging anyway. And sometimes the fragger that you'd put in that role, taking strats out of it, wouldn't be as good at playing that supportive aspect to the game that might be more cerebral that the in-game leader would. Because I know myself from being an in-game leader and talking to a lot of in-game leaders, one of the reasons why I tend to get along with the in-game leaders better than a lot of the star players is actually because we think on a similar frequency or wavelength about the game, and as much as they often share this opinion I have, which is when you're the in-game leader, if you have certain stars who aren't very cerebral thinking stars themselves, which a lot of the really sick aimers aren't, because they're so focused on their crosshair and getting the crazy aim kills, that if you're the in-game leader with those sorts of players, you tend to try and take as much thought as you can away from them players by putting yourself in like key trigger positions or linchpin positions where you will read the game yourself without having to communicate to that guy and distract him. You'll make a call to a separate player, or you'll do something without necessarily overtly articulating it to make the round work, to fill in the little blanks, have the shading, have the nuance of the round. And so in that sense, it's not always the case that upgrading the fragging of the player will be good. That's why it's interesting that most people go from that angle. For me, usually, it's a better discussion to have if it's like both combined. You want to have a genius guy standing behind you, and you currently have one, but his fragging isn't really particularly good. And so you could upgrade some fragging, but also take a genius guy and retain him in the team. There are other teams where you could get a guy to stand behind you to do a decent job of calling tactics and upgrade the fragging power maybe, but that might actually make the team worse as a result. So examples of in-game leaders where it would be obvious to do this, well, one that actually seemed to work quite well was Hellraisers at the end of 2014 at DreamHack Winter in late November. They got Blade, the legendary in-game leader, at the moment of Kirchnet, and previously of teams like Amazing Gaming back in CS 1.6. He stood behind them just for this one tournament, and he did this sort of in-game leading, and it allowed them to beat Fnatic on Mirage, which is one of Fnatic's best maps at the time, or at least like probably their third best map, in a 16-14 game in the group stage, and as a result they got out in first place. They got to play NIP. Unfortunately, they got smashed by NIP, so the story kind of ended there, but they put themselves in a great position. So there's an obvious... Oh, they also thrashed C9 in the same tournament. So everyone who looked at this, and especially considering where a train wreck Hellraisers had been leading up to then, was like, right, this would be great. If Blade could stay, this would help a lot more. And obviously, Hellraisers was famous for having a lot of aim skill, actually, but not so much routine and understanding of how to adapt to the game. They had a very one-dimensional playing style. Now, examples that often people will suggest, which certainly bear talking about, is Sean Gares on Cloud9. If you take in-game leading off him entirely, he's going to be like a below-average fragging player on the top international level, and that's where they need to be on the top international level as a team. If you give him the in-game role, he's going to be a good in-game leader, not the best, but he's still going to lack fragging particularly. And if you were to put him behind, people hypothesize he could do a really good job of reading the game, telling people what to do, and you could bring in more fragging or more an aggressive player. That's why I would suggest to open up this other aspect and make Cloud9 a little bit less one-dimensional in terms of their terrorist side play. Sure, there's something to that. The other most obvious example is Existence on Titan, because we've seen when they've taken the in-game leadership away from him, in this last era, he started off alright in terms of fragging when they took the in-game leadership away to Shocks, but he's pretty much dropped off a cliff recently. He's been having some really bad games. He's playing quite terribly, and the whole reason of having him before is even if he played terribly, he was the one who would activate the level of the top players and use them in an impressive way and find trick smokes that he'd be able to apply to get the team into favourable scenarios, read the opponent well. That's why they had so many wins against Fnatic in incredible fashion. That's why they were able to have these crazy runs to top fours, to finals, even when they were clearly not even a top four team in the world, but they were having these performances, partly because he is one of the masterminds of the game. Now, the positives of doing this is, yes, it can allow for more firepower. And some teams, clearly, more firepower is a very easy kind of brute force approach to try and get better. It means you can have more roles in a team. Now, first of all, whenever we talk about roles, you obviously don't have one of each role in a team. That's where it gets a bit misleading in terms of roles. But on certain teams, you might have very passive guys, and you might have a guy who's designated as the entry fragger, for example, but who's not suited to the same types of entry fragging that someone like Bialy is on Virtus Pro, where he'll brute force go in through a smoke by himself with only one flash coming after him, and he's going to take this particular shot here in a very confident fashion that few players can really have the balls to do it that way. So if you were able to add in another player who's like a pure entry fragger to a team that had everything else set up around it, great team might look like a Cloud9 or a Team Liquid. These sorts of teams could probably benefit. Actually, probably CLG more than Team Liquid, I think. Team Liquid seem to have figured that out a little bit. We can see how this would potentially immediately help you. Likewise, having this guy stood behind you, in theory, he could get a better overview of the game, because instead of just looking at his screen, and then if he's a mastermind, using his brain to take in all the information and have a good visual picture in his mind and imagination of what's going on, he could literally be looking at all the screens. He could look at the screen, then he could trigger something over here. I could see how that could allow a better macro perspective, like literally being able to watch the screen, then tell this guy, right, go now as this guy goes in. Now, the great leaders can do that to a particular degree, especially if they synchronize it manually, like calling a set time or knowing that this player is going to go in roughly this time, and then they'll trigger it themselves. But you could obviously do this to the second precise manner if you were stood behind them. It would also mean, obviously, that this player wouldn't have to focus on his own fragging, so that would also take away some of that. And if he was a super genius, maybe this would allow him to visualize the game even more and see where things are going to happen more. I could see this being a case in certain instances, but it's not as overwhelmingly positive an approach as people seem to think when they suggest these examples. Like, they just assume it would make it even better. Like, oh, Shulgaz then he'd be reading the game like genius, and then he'd have more fragging. There'd be a way better team. Not necessarily. First of all, when you're not literally playing the game, you're going to have a wider macro perspective, but your understanding of the micro perspective won't be as good. You won't be as immersed in the game. You won't be able to feel not only opponents on your screen to get a sense of how difficult it is in certain scenarios. Like, one of the great things that people often talk about who are superstar players in these different esports games, CSGO, Dota 2, League of Legends, StarCraft 2, is when you're playing a particularly either great player or very tricky player, to the spectator, it might look like, oh, he's not doing much here, he's nothing doing. But when you play against him and he pushes you back in certain situations, or he surprises you, one of the great terms people will often use is like, you have to play the guy to feel what the resistance is like, to feel like the intimidation of like, he could attack me any second here because I know he's done that in the past. Or when I try going in here, it just seems absurdly difficult to get into this particular area or to fight on this particular sort of ground. And that's always there in your mind. So as a result, you're shaping the game around what you think can work. If you're stood behind and you're not feeling that directly, you might be able to think, oh, we could go in here now, or just go to there, or just rotate back around. It's no problem. He's going to be his gap there. But you won't necessarily quite understand the more nuanced dynamics of what's actually going on in the game. So you will lose that as this particular coach stood behind. There's also the factor that some of these guys who are super geniuses in that particular sense, part of it comes from that. They're feeling out and reading the game, and that's feeding into their intuition. And when I think of intuition, I don't think of it as some magical construct, at least in this specific instance. I think of it as, if you imagine your mind as an iceberg, the conscious part of your mind, let's put that's only going to be the tip of the iceberg. And even if an iceberg looks huge, we know that the vast majority of the iceberg is all underwater. So imagine your conscious mind is the tip of the iceberg, Illuminati confirmed. Then the part below the water is the unconscious mind. So to me, when you access your intuition is literally the communicative language, usually symbol-based metaphors, between the subconscious, unconscious area of your mind and the conscious part, explicitly conscious. And so when you can access that by learning how to gauge what your intuition is telling you, you're accessing a wider perspective, a more advanced computer level, if you want to use that metaphor of the way your mind works. So part of that can come from accessing in-game stuff and then your sense for what's going on. So the super genius in gamers, I think, access that more often and are able to generate that into how they visualize the game and then what they can do in terms of the basic communication and what to tell people to do. There's also the factor that, yes, you could trigger some things more specifically, but more small things, that the person's used to them doing themselves within the game, where they throw a flash or they watch at a certain angle, they're not actually going to be able to do that. They can try and trigger other people to do it, but that in itself is going to, even though you're taking away some timing for the bigger macro things, you're going to be adding in time and delay and lag and having to hope someone else knows what you mean and understands your internal dictionary to the guy who's now taking your role to do certain things within triggering an action. So as I said, a lot of game leaders like me, they would take a lot of that out of the hands of other people by giving themselves a lot of that responsibility, or not necessarily having to bother this guy and burden him by telling him I'm going to do this, just having him think he's doing what he's doing and I'm the one flashing over here or watching his back for a millisecond so he can't be attacked in that sense. So there's going to be some give and take there. It's also going to be the case that it's actually going to be quite rare to do that sort of job, that you're going to have players who weren't in-game leaders or haven't played some sort of more cerebral game like that. Like, yes, it'd be great if everyone had an MBK type player who can do anything in theory and can do this thing where he'll build himself into the base philosophy and strategy and system of the team with his in-game leader to make sure there's always that foundation that you can then add the stars and the hybrid stars onto to make a great team. Those players are worth their weight in gold. There's barely any of them exist. There's a few. There's a Crims, there's an MBK, Zipniks. There's really not that many in the world. That's why these guys are all on the World Championship teams and all incredibly successful when you add them with the right star players. There's also the case that as soon as you become the coach standing outside, some of these players, unfortunately, aren't going to think of you the same way. You're not in the game with them. They might not be able to relate to you and think, oh, he doesn't know what's going on right now. It's not as easy as he thinks to go through this area. They might stop listening to you. They might view you differently. You're not right in there in the trenches with them in the same particular sense. You've now, also, think of this. People never bring this up. When you're the in-game leader, you've got 4 people to direct and you take care of your part of the game. We've now got 5 people to direct. That can be even harder to corral if you were a Hellraisers type team or a team that's a lot of aimers and they're doing whatever they want. That could be even more difficult to some degree and require an even more exceptional sort of person to manage that. Then there's the fact that there might be information overload. There's now 5 people's communication coming to each other and yours. There's another voice being added into the mix. You can obviously see how that would be difficult in some senses. Whereas the kind of economical, efficient comms that great leaders have and establishing their teams, usually the great ones tend to pare the communication down to the key aspects and trigger words that they need. They don't want 5 people talking all the time. Now, in terms of actual cases, we've seen from the Blade example that when we see what a mess some of the CIS teams are, and now we see now with Starix does it for Na'Vi, actually that seems like a positive. That seems like a good move. And we saw Na'Vi went to the final of the Major. Likewise, with teams like Kingwin in the past, yes, Dennis could have done the in-game leading, Rain can do it, but with those caliber of players, nearly all were like good fraggers, you probably do want a guy stood behind, because in that sort of scenario, you're not losing anything out, and that is just the whole approach that team has. You want to kind of run and gun a bit, or let players like Rain just come in, like get them in through the mid-game, so then they're going to be in the clutch run situation later. Now, is it the future of CS? That's really the question. I think that's overhyped. I think there will always be in-game leader, genius type guys, and crucially, because it's never going to be quite the same to come out of the game and just stand behind, a lot of them are going to want to play still. So most of those guys, unfortunately, they're the ideal candidate to be the coach guy, who you take the risk on, won't be available for that. Now, I'd love it if they could, like if they could get into like an Ender's Game type scenario where it's more important to like direct the battle than to directly take fucking a gunfight yourself. That would be the dream, obviously, if you could. But that's going to have to engage them to where they realise, let's win on the chess game instead of this particular small instance as well. Give up some of that to be able to be the mastermind who wins the whole game by using more tools at your disposal. That would be cool, but I think it'll be very hard to break the paradigm and get people on board with that, even for the great players. There's also the case that the truly great in-game leaders often also, if I'm thinking of like Ave in 1.6, obviously like God B in 1.6, some of these people also probably are better in the game, because what they can do within the concept and the construct of their own particular tactic, the role that they will play, is so vital and so precise and yet so complex and subtle in the things that they'll do that they can probably make it work. I used to say about Ave, the Danish player from MTW DK, was never that great a player. He was like a very average top tier pro, in fact slightly below average when you think of some of the mega skilled players in the 1.6, but he was very good at performing the part within the tactic that he had very well and getting a kill within the tactic in a certain area where he'd find the easier kill to get for himself, but that would set up the kills for his superstars to destroy the whole game. So people like that, it probably won't be as good if they're not in that role, and they won't accept it. Then you look at the fact that, okay, just as a guy like Happy in CSGO does very minimal in game leading, but then is a monster as an individual player as a result of how he impacts the game from within it. Same, that's what God B did in 1.6. He would frag, he would read, he would call from within the game as well. So it's also not as simple as thinking it will always be an upgrade in this sense. For certain teams like a Kingwin, like a Hellraiser, I think it's the obvious move to try and do. So I do want to see it more with some teams, especially if it means we can get legendary old players who don't play CSGO or want to quit or don't have the skills to keep them in the game. I think that would be a great way to have like a spillover of great players who can be the coach stood behind. So in that sense, it would make sense. Thanks to the old alpha draft.